The silence of the base library wasn't just a lack of noise. It was a physical weight. A thick blanket of paper and dust that Elijah Godwin used to wrap himself away from a world that had become too loud. At 7 o'clock, the air smelled of floor wax and the faint, sweet rot of old binding glue. Eli moved through the stacks with a soft, rolling gait, his sneakers making no sound on the industrial carpet. To any passing observer, he was just a scrawny man in a faded polo shirt, his shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to take up as little space as possible. But as he placed a returned copy of The Art of War back on its shelf, Eli's eyes didn't just see the spine of the book. Without a conscious thought, his gaze swept the room. North exit, clear. South fire door, obstructed by a cart of unsorted biographies. Choke point created by the intersection of the history and science sections. In under 3 seconds, he had mapped the geometry of the room, identified 3 potential firing lanes, and noted the reflection in the window that gave him a view of the corridor outside. It was a reflex, a ghost of a life he had buried a decade ago. As instinctual as breathing and just as impossible to quit. He retreated to the front desk, his movements economical and small. He liked the library because it was a place of order. Books had specific homes. Information was categorized. It was the opposite of the chaotic, blood-slicked riverbeds of his nightmares. The peace was shattered when the heavy glass doors swung open with a violent thud. For Marines, their frames nearly bursting out of their desert camo fatigues, marched in. Their energy was a jagged blade cutting through the stillness. At the lead was Lance Corporal Tyler Chris, a man who seemed to carry his own atmosphere of unearned confidence. He didn't walk, he conquered the floor tiles, his boots ringing out with an intentional, rhythmic aggression. "Yo, Pops," Chris called out, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. He leaned over the circulation desk, his muscular forearms resting on the wood. He was grinning, but there was a sharp, mocking edge to his eyes. The look of a predator who had found something harmless to toy with. "You got anything in here with more pictures and fewer words? My boys and I are bored out of our skulls waiting for the range to open." Eli didn't look up immediately. He finished scanning a barcode. His hands steady despite the sudden spike of adrenaline that tasted like copper in the back of his throat. "The graphic novels are in the 741 section, Corporal. Third aisle on the left." Chris let out a short, barking laugh, glancing back at his squad. They were all smirking, their body language loose and arrogant. One of them leaned against a shelf, a casual disrespect for the quiet Eli worked so hard to maintain. 741. "You hear that? He's got the whole world filed away in that little head of theirs," Chris said, turning back to Eli. He reached out, his hand hovering near Eli's shoulder. Not quite touching, but asserting a dominant proximity. "You ever get tired of it, Eli? Hiding back here in the dark? You look like you haven't seen the sun since the Bush administration. You're looking a little fragile." Eli finally looked up. His eyes were flat, neutral, the expressionless mask of a man who had learned to be a mirror so that others saw only what they expected to see. He saw the way Chris stood. His weight centered but his chin too high, a classic sign of overconfidence. He saw the tactical vest Chris wore, slightly loose at the shoulders. He saw 4 ways to put the corporal on the floor before the man could even blink. Instead, Eli offered a small, apologetic smile. "The books don't mind the dark, Corporal. And neither do I." "Yeah, I bet," Chris sneered, his eyes scanning Eli's thin frame with visible disdain. "Must be nice. No dirt, no sweat, no stakes. Just you and your alphabet. Some of us actually have a job to do." As the squad sauntered away, their laughter trailing behind them like exhaust, Eli reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against a small, serrated piece of metal, a memory he couldn't throw away. He took a slow breath, letting the rookie librarian persona settle back over him like a shroud, while his mind continued to track the Marines' positions through the stacks by the sound of their heavy boots. He was a ghost in his own life, waiting for the silence to return, unaware that the quiet was about to end forever. The heavy glass doors had barely settled from the Marines' disruptive exit before the library's artificial silence began to knit itself back together. Eli stayed behind the desk, his hands performing the mindless ritual of straightening a stack of library cards, though his mind was still tracking the vibrations of boots on the floorboards 2 aisles over. Lance Corporal Tyler Chris hadn't quite left. He was hovering near the military history section, his large frame leaning precariously against a shelf of fragile memoirs. He caught Eli's eye and mimicked a slow, exaggerated yawn, patting his flat stomach. "Hey, Eli," he called out, loud enough to make a nearby student flinch. "You ever think about hitting the base gym? I mean, I've seen MRE crackers with more muscle mass than those arms. You keep skipping meals. A stiff breeze is going to blow you right into the fiction section." His squad let out a collective snicker. The kind of sound that echoed with the casual cruelty of the young and the strong. Eli didn't take the bait. He simply adjusted his glasses, the light catching the lenses to hide the cold, calculating stillness in his pupils. "Gravity is a constant, Corporal," Eli replied softly. "I find it's easier to move when you aren't carrying around unnecessary weight." Chris scoffed, shaking his head as he finally turned toward the exit. "Whatever helps you sleep at night, Pops. Just try not to break a hip sorting the magazines." Once the doors hissed shut, the library felt hollower, more fragile. Eli let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He moved from behind the desk, intending to fix the shelf Chris had leaned on, but stopped when he reached the back corner near the windows. Sitting in a high-backed leather chair that had seen better decades was Gunnery Sergeant Ray. Ray was a fixture of the library, a man made of scarred mahogany and bitter memories. His legs were covered by a wool blanket despite the humidity, and his hands, gnarled by arthritis and older violence, trembled slightly as they held a folded newspaper. "Arrogance is a loud neighbor, isn't it, Eli?" Ray rasped, his voice sounding like gravel being turned in a drum. Eli sat on the edge of the adjacent table, dropping the librarian persona just an inch. "They're young, Gunny. They think the world is made of glass, and they're the only ones holding hammers." Ray grunted, squinting at the crossword puzzle in his lap. "They're gonna learn that glass cuts back. Eventually." He tapped a frustrated finger against a blank row of boxes. 13 across. A bridge over a valley. 6 letters. "It's eating my brain." Eli looked at the puzzle upside down. He didn't have to think. His mind, trained to process terrain and infrastructure at a glance, filled in the gap instantly. "Viaduct," he said quietly. Ray paused, his pen hovering. He counted the boxes. "VI, damn. Right again." He scribbled the letters in with a shaky hand. "You've got a strange head for words, son. And a stranger way of standing. I've watched you. You don't walk like a librarian. You walk like you're expecting the carpet to explode." Eli's expression remained a neutral mask. But he reached out and gently took the pen from Ray's trembling fingers to help him circle a finished clue. "I just like to know where the exits are, Ray. Old habits." "I know that look," Ray whispered, his eyes suddenly sharp, piercing through the fog of age. "I saw it in the Delta boys back in the day. The ones who came back, but didn't really arrive. You're hiding, Eli. You're hiding in these books like they're a bunker." "It's a quiet bunker," Eli conceded, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "Quiet doesn't mean safe," Ray replied, leaning back as he watched Eli's thin, steady hands return the pen. "The storm always finds the tall grass, but it's the roots that keep you standing. Those kids today, they don't have roots. Just a lot of wind." Eli offered a ghost of a smile and stood up, the scrawny librarian once again. "Maybe. But for now, let's just finish the puzzle." He pointed to 24 down. "Try tenacious for the one about the stubborn warrior. It fits the grid." Ray chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Tenacious. Yeah, that sounds about right for a man like you." Afternoon sun crawled across the library floor, illuminating millions of dancing dust motes that, for a flickering second, looked like the kicked-up grit of a Somali desert. Eli sat in the dimness of the history stacks, a heavy volume on his lap. But his eyes were fixed on nothing. The smell of old paper vanished, replaced by the acrid, metallic tang of spent brass and the overwhelming scent of sun-baked trash and diesel. In his mind, it was always 2003. The silence of the library was swallowed by the rhythmic, chest-thumping thwack-thwack-thwack of Black Hawk rotors. He could feel the vibration in his teeth. He wasn't Master Sergeant Godwin, the scrawny librarian. He was Spectre 1-to-1, the man the unit sent when a door needed to be kicked or a problem needed to be erased. He remembered the heat most of all, a thick, wet blanket that made your gear feel like it weighed 1,000 pounds. They were moving through a narrow alleyway in Mogadishu, slicing the pie around corners with a fluid, lethal grace. Beside him was Miller, 22 years old, with a gap-toothed grin and a photograph of a girl from Ohio tucked into his helmet band. Miller was the best breacher Eli had ever trained, a kid who moved like lightning and laughed at the face of God. "Spectre, move left," Miller had shouted over the roar of a Technical's heavy machine gun. Eli had moved. He had followed the protocol. He had cleared his sector. But the world doesn't always follow the manual. A wall that should have been solid crumbled under a rocket-propelled grenade, and the air turned into a storm of jagged stone and fire. Eli remembered the ringing in his ears, a high, lonely whistle that sounded exactly like the tea kettle in the library break room. When the smoke cleared, the alley was gone. Miller was gone. All that remained was a jagged hole in the earth and a silence so profound it felt like the end of the world. Eli had crawled through the rubble, his fingers clawing at the hot dirt, whispering a name that the wind simply blew away. He had been the instructor. He was supposed to have the answers. He was supposed to be the one who kept them alive. A sudden, sharp clack snapped him back to the present. A student had dropped a highlighter on a nearby table. Eli blinked, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He looked down at his hands. They were thin, ink-stained, and trembling. He rubbed his thumb over the calluses on his palms, marks left not by pens, but by years of gripping a cold steel trigger. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, circular object. It wasn't a coin, but a serrated piece of a jagged shrapnel he'd pulled from his own vest that day, the only thing he had left of that alleyway. He turned it over and over, the sharp edges biting into his skin, a grounding pain that reminded him he was still here, even if he didn't want to be. He felt the weight of the ghost sitting on his shoulders, heavier than any rucksack he had ever carried. He had built this library into a fortress of silence because he couldn't stand the noise of his own thoughts. He had made himself scrawny and small, hoping that if he looked like a man who couldn't fight, the world would stop asking him to. "You okay, Mr. Godwin?" a young private asked, pausing near the desk with a book on tactical maneuvers. Eli looked up, forcing the mask of the harmless librarian back into place. He smoothed his polo shirt and offered a tired, thin smile. "Just a bit of dust in the air, son," he said, his voice steady but hollow. "It gets everywhere if you aren't careful." He watched the private walk away, noting the kid's upright posture and the way he carried himself with the same invincibility Miller once had. Eli wanted to reach out, to tell him that the world was made of shadows and sharp corners, but he just turned back to his books. He was a man hiding in the stacks, a ghost among ghosts, waiting for a piece that never quite seemed to arrive. The following Tuesday, the sterile, high-altitude silence of the base command center felt a world away from the dusty comfort of the library. Eli stood at the edge of a mahogany conference table, his posture intentionally slight, hands clasped loosely in front of his faded trousers. He looked like a man who spent his life worrying about late fees, not the lethal architecture of a modern kill box. At the head of the table, Colonel Marcus Hale leaned back in a plush leather chair, flanked by two junior officers who were busy scrolling through tablets. Hale was a man who believed in the absolute divinity of data. He didn't look at Eli. He looked through him, as if the librarian were a glitch in his morning schedule. "I appreciate the diligence, Mr. Godwin," Hale said, his voice carrying the smooth, polished edge of a man who had fought more battles in boardrooms than trenches. "But we've invested $4 million into the Phase 3 automated range. It's the most sophisticated training environment in the DoD. The sensors are self-correcting." Eli cleared his throat, the sound small and tentative. "Respectfully, Colonel, I've been observing the logs from the library's terminal. The localized sensor clusters in Sector 4 are showing a 3-millisecond lag during high-moisture morning hours. It's a ghost in the logic gate. If the system fails to recognize a ceasefire command while the turrets are in active tracking mode, the fail-safes won't engage." One of the junior officers snickered, not even looking up from his screen. "A 3-millisecond lag? Pops, I think you've been spending too much time reading sci-fi. These are hardened systems. They don't have ghosts." Eli felt a familiar spark of heat behind his ribs, the old, cold fire of a master sergeant who had seen men die because of hardened systems that failed in the mud. He suppressed it, keeping his voice soft. "It's not the hardware, sir. It's the transition between the thermal imaging and the movement-based logic. In a high-stress drill, the system could misidentify a friendly silhouette as a static target if the sensor recalibrates at the wrong moment. It creates a killbox scenario with no manual override." Colonel Hale finally looked at Eli, his eyes narrowing with a patronizing pity. He stood up, smoothing the front of his perfectly pressed uniform. "Godwin, you're a librarian. You're a civilian who sees the world through the lens of a cataloging system. You deal in certainties and quiet rooms. Ideal in the big picture. The future of Marine Corps readiness. We can't pause a multi-unit training cycle because a man who organizes biographies has a feeling about a sensor lag. It isn't a feeling, Colonel, Eli said, his voice dropping an octave, gaining a sudden, razor-thin edge of authority that made Hale pause for a fraction of a second. It's a pattern, and patterns in a live-fire environment usually end in body bags. The room went cold. Hale's face hardened, the professional mask slipping to reveal a deep-seated arrogance. That will be all, Mr. Godwin. Your concern has been noted and filed. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have actual warriors to prepare for the field. Eli didn't argue. He knew that tone. It was the same tone he'd heard from bureaucrats in the green zone before the world fell apart. He simply nodded, the scrawny librarian returning to his eyes. Of course, Colonel. I'll get back to my books. As he walked out, his mind was already moving, calculating the distance from the library to Sector 4 and the time it would take to sprint across the open tarmac if the whine of the sentry guns changed pitch. He hadn't just warned them, he had scouted them. And as the door clicked shut behind him, Eli realized with a sinking heart that the big picture Hale was so proud of was about to be painted in a color the colonel wasn't prepared for. The afternoon heat had turned the base into a shimmering kiln by the time Eli returned to the library. He found the peace he had spent months cultivating shattered once again. In the center of the main aisle, Lance CPL. Tyler Chris and his squad had cornered a young private, a kid named Eris with glasses that kept sliding down his nose and a stack of manuals on high-frequency radio repair clutched to his chest. Chris was leaning into the boy's space, a sneer plastered across his face. What's the matter, Sparky? Too busy reading about wires to learn how to move in the dirt? He reached out and slapped the books from Eris's hands. The heavy manuals hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. This isn't a school. It's the Corps. Maybe if you spent less time in this graveyard with the mummy over there. He jerked a thumb toward Eli. You'd actually look like a soldier. Eli stopped 10 feet away. He didn't puff out his chest or raise his voice. He let his shoulders slump further, adopting the posture of a man who was tired of being stepped on. He looked small, fragile, and utterly harmless. Corporal, Eli said, his voice a dry rasp. The boy was just returning those. There's no need for the dramatics. Chris turned, his eyes lighting up with predatory glee. He had been looking for a reason to break the librarian all day. Dramatics? I'm trying to instill some combat mindset, Pops. Something you wouldn't know anything about. Why don't you show him? Since you're so worried about his education. Chris stepped closer, his shadow falling over Eli. We're heading to the Phase 3 range for a stress test simulation. Why don't you come along? We'll put you in a vest, give you a trainer rifle, and see if you can even find the trigger. If you can make it through the first gate without hyperventilating, I'll leave the kid alone for the rest of the month. I'll even pick up his books for him. The squad erupted in low, mocking laughter. They saw a scrawny man in a faded polo shirt who looked like he'd struggle to carry a grocery bag. They didn't see the way Eli's feet were positioned, a perfect 45-degree offset that allowed for an instantaneous pivot. They didn't see his eyes scanning the corporal's throat and knees. Eli looked at Private Eris, who was trembling, his face flushed with humiliation. Eli felt the weight of the serrated shrapnel in his pocket. He thought about Miller, and the way the arrogant always assumed the quiet were weak. A combat drill, Eli murmured, looking down at his scuffed sneakers. In the automated range? Scared? Chris taunted, leaning down so they were eye to eye. It's just a simulation, Eli. Purely digital. Mostly. I don't think that's a good idea, Eli said, playing the part of the coward with practiced ease. He let his bottom lip tremble just a fraction. I haven't been on a range in a very long time. The noise, it's perfect, Chris grinned, sensing blood in the water. Then it settled. You against the machine. Let's see if that big picture you were talking to the colonel about holds up when the targets start popping. Eli sighed a long, weary sound. He slowly knelt and picked up one of Eris's manuals, handing it back to the private with a steady hand that the boy was too shaken to notice. Fine, Eli said softly, his head down, looking every bit the victim. If it means you'll leave the private to his studies, I'll go. As he followed the swaggering Marines out toward the transport, Eli didn't look back. He kept his gait shuffling and his gaze averted. He knew the Marines thought they were taking a sheep to the slaughter for an afternoon's entertainment. What they didn't realize was that they were inviting a ghost back into the world of the living, and the ghost was the only thing standing between them and the malfunction he knew was coming. The Phase 3 range was a cathedral of concrete and cold steel, humming with the low-frequency vibration of 1,000 interconnected sensors. Inside the observation bay, the air was conditioned to a crisp, artificial chill. Eli stood at the edge of the staging area, fumbling with the straps of a tactical vest that was 2 sizes too large for his frame. To the Marines watching from the glass-enclosed booth, he looked like a child playing dress-up in his father's gear. "Remember the rules, Pops," Tyler Chris's voice crackled over the intercom, dripping with sadistic amusement. "Blue targets are friendlies. Red are hostiles. Try not to trip over your own feet when the floor starts moving." Eli didn't respond. He stepped into the kill house section of the range, his shoulders rounded, his head ducked low. He held the trainer rifle, a weighted replica that fired non-lethal infrared bursts, as if it were a strange and heavy piece of luggage. Then the world broke. It started with a flicker of the overhead stadium lights, followed by a sound that made Eli's marrow turn to ice. The heavy, hydraulic clackwhir of the safety shutters slamming shut, locking the exits. The digital simulation interface on the walls sputtered and died, replaced by the ominous, red glow of the emergency system. "Hey, what the hell?" Chris's voice came through the speakers again, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by a sharp, jagged edge of panic. "The override isn't responding. The system is." The intercom cut into a screech of static. High above, in the shadows of the rafters, the automated sentry guns didn't retract. Instead, they began to pivot, their optical sensors glowing a predatory crimson. A motorized belt fed a stream of live 5.56 mm ammunition into the chambers with a series of metallic snaps that echoed like thunder in the enclosed space. The system hadn't just glitched, it had defaulted to its active defense protocol. To the computer, everyone inside the wire was now an unauthorized combatant. A burst of live fire stitched a row of jagged holes into the concrete inches from where Private Eris stood paralyzed near the entrance. The boy screamed, dropping to his knees. The Marines in the booth were hammering on the reinforced glass, their faces pale as they realized they were watching a slaughter in the making. In that heartbeat, the Librarian died. Eli's spine straightened with the audible crack of a whip. His shoulders squared, and the scrawny hunch vanished, replaced by a coiled, lethal tension. The switch didn't just flip, it shattered. His eyes, previously dull and apologetic, became twin chips of flint, scanning the rafters not with fear, but with the cold, diagnostic precision of a master technician. 2 sentries, 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. Cyclic rate, 800 rounds per minute. Sensor lag, 3 milliseconds. Eli didn't run, he flowed. He lunged across the floor, snagging Private Eris by the back of his tactical vest and hurling the boy behind a reinforced ballistic pillar, just as a second burst of lead chewed the air where the kid's head had been. "Stay down. Don't move until I say." Eli's voice wasn't a rasp anymore. It was a command, heavy, resonant, and absolute. It was the voice of the man who had survived Mogadishu, the man who had trained the hunters of the night. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the serrated piece of shrapnel, his thumb pressing into the sharp edge until he felt the bite of pain. It grounded him. He wasn't in a library. He wasn't in a bunker. He was in the X, the center of the danger zone, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt entirely, terrifyingly at home. The Marines in the booth froze. They weren't looking at a librarian anymore. They were looking at a ghost who had put on flesh, a predator moving with a terrifying, predatory economy. Eli Godwin was gone. Master Sergeant Spectre was back, and he was already calculating the 8 seconds it would take to end the machine. The lead rounds continued to hammer the concrete pillar, sending shards of grit into Eli's face, but he didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He was no longer the man who worried about the overdue status of a biography. He was a kinetic equation, calculating angles and velocity in a world that had slowed to a crawl. Behind the pillar, Private Eris was hyperventilating, his eyes blown wide with the raw, jagged terror of the uninitiated. Eli reached back without looking, his hand landing on the boy's shoulder with the weight of an anchor. He didn't offer a platitude. He gave a command. "Eyes on me," Eli said. The voice was a low, vibrational frequency that cut through the thunder of the turrets. It was the voice of the unit. Eris looked, and for a second, the panic subsided, replaced by a confused awe. The scrawny librarian was gone. Standing before him was a man who seemed to have grown 3 inches, his frame corded with a terrifying, predatory grace. Eli raised his left hand, flashing a series of silent, fluid tactical signals toward the observation booth. Hold position. Suppressing fire imminent. Clear the lane. Tyler, Chris, and the Marines behind the glass froze. They didn't need to be Delta to understand those signals. They were the universal language of the elite, delivered with an authority that made their own training feel like a summer camp. They watched, paralyzed, as Eli transitioned the weighted trainer rifle to his shoulder. It was a toy compared to the live-fire sentries, but in his hands, it was a tool of geometry. Eli moved. He didn't run. He flowed out from behind the pillar in a movement known as slicing the pie. It was a masterpiece of elite economy. He revealed only inches of his profile at a time, his body a tight, disciplined axis. Every step was a heel-to-toe roll, keeping his head perfectly level. His eyes locked into the optic. The first turret in the rafters whirred, its sensor trying to lock onto the movement. But Eli wasn't where the logic gate expected him to be. He used the 3-millisecond lag he'd warned the colonel about, stutter-stepping at the exact moment the sensor recalibrated. Pop, pop. Eli fired 2 infrared bursts from the trainer rifle. They weren't meant to destroy, they were meant to confuse. The beams hit the turret's optical housing, flooding its thermal sensors with noise. The machine hesitated, its barrel tracking wildly as it tried to reset. In those 2 seconds of mechanical indecision, Eli was across the open floor. He moved with a centered gravity, his feet finding purchase on the slick concrete as if he were magnetized to the earth. He reached a secondary control junction at the base of the rafter supports. From the booth, Tyler, Chris watched in a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. He saw the librarian, the man he had called fragile, vault over a waist-high barricade without breaking his stride. His movement so smooth it looked like smoke drifting across the range. Eli wasn't just surviving, he was hunting. He was dismantling a multi-million-dollar security system with a plastic rifle and a decade of suppressed muscle memory. Eli reached the junction box, his fingers moving with the blurred speed of a concert pianist. He didn't need to see the wires, he felt the pulse of the system. He ripped a bypass cable from his vest, a piece of kit he'd quietly carried just in case, and jammed it into the service port. The roar of the sentries stopped. The barrels slumped, the red predatory eyes fading to a dull, dead gray. The emergency shutters groaned and began to retract, allowing the natural afternoon light to bleed back into the room. Eli didn't celebrate. He didn't look at the booth. He stayed in his crouch for 5 long seconds. His rifle transitioned to the secondary low-ready position, his eyes still scanning the rafters for a secondary threat. Only when the hum of the cooling fans died did he stand up. The specter faded. The tension left his shoulders, and he seemed to shrink back into the faded polo shirt. He turned to Private Eris, who was still shaking behind the pillar. "Check your equipment, Private," Eli said, his voice returning to the quiet, dry rasp of the stacks. "Panic is a luxury we don't have. Pick up your manuals. We're leaving." The mechanical screech of the heavy blast doors finally yielding to the manual override echoed through the range like a dying animal. The air inside Sector 4 was thick with the smell of ozone and pulverized concrete, a haze that hung in the shafts of returning sunlight. Eli didn't move from his position by the central junction. He remained in a low, disciplined crouch, his eyes fixed on the dead optics of the overhead turrets, waiting for the one thing every veteran knows. The silence after a fight is often more dangerous than the noise. From the observation booth, Tyler, Chris, and his squad spilled out onto the concrete floor. They didn't run. They approached with the hesitant, jerky movements of men who had just seen a ghost. Chris, whose face was a mask of pale shock, stopped 10 feet away. He looked at the scrawny librarian, then at the smoking holes in the concrete, then back at Eli's eyes. He saw the cold, predatory depth there, the specter, and he couldn't find his voice. The mocking insults he had prepared for the morning felt like ash in his mouth. The sound of sharp, rhythmic clicks on the concrete announced the arrival of the command staff. Colonel Marcus Hale marched in, his face flushed with a mixture of terror and bureaucratic fury, but he was eclipsed by the woman walking beside him. Commander Rebecca Sloan wore her navy whites like armor. As a high-ranking liaison for Joint Special Operations Command, she carried an aura of quiet, absolute power that made even Hale look like a junior cadet. She ignored the colonel's sputtering excuses and the trembling Marines. Her eyes were locked on Eli. She stopped 3 paces from him. Eli slowly rose from his crouch. The transformation was unsettling. As he stood, the slumped shoulders and timid gaze of the librarian didn't return. He stood with the effortless, centered power of a man who had spent a lifetime in the X. Status, Senior Chief? Sloane asked. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a decade of shared history. Eli's hands, which everyone had assumed were thin and weak, came to his sides with a crisp, lethal snap. Range neutralized, Commander. System override complete. 1 civilian and 4 Marines accounted for. No casualties. The title Senior Chief hit the room like a physical blow. Tyler Chris staggered back half a step, his mouth hanging open. He hadn't just bullied a librarian. He had spent weeks mocking a senior chief of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, a Delta-tier instructor whose name was whispered in the corridors of Fort Bragg and Dam Neck. Colonel Hale tried to step forward, his voice cracking. Godwin, I had no idea. Your file, it said. My file said what I wanted it to say. Colonel, Eli interrupted, his voice a calm, level blade. I told you the sensors were failing. You chose to see a librarian. Next time, try seeing the threat. Commander Sloane stepped closer, her expression softening into something resembling grim respect. We've been looking for you for 2 years, Eli. The bridge program needs an architect. The kids coming up. They have the tech, but they don't have the soul. They don't have the stillness. Eli looked down at his hands, then at Private Eris, who was still clutching his manuals as if they were a life raft. He thought about the ghost of Miller and the alleyway in Mogadishu. He realized that hiding in the silence of the stacks hadn't healed him. It had just kept him in the dark. I have a lot of books to shelve, Commander, Eli said softly. The books can wait, Sloane replied. The Corps can't. As Sloane turned to lead the way out, Tyler Chris did the only thing his training left him with. He snapped to attention. One by one, the other 3 Marines followed suit, their spines straightening, their chins tucked. There was no command given, no sergeant barking orders. It was a silent, spontaneous recognition of a superior predator. As Eli walked past them, the 4 Marines rendered a sharp, quivering salute, a gesture of bone-deep respect for the man who had saved them from their own arrogance. Eli didn't return the salute with his hands. He simply met Chris's eyes for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement that the scrawny man was gone and the instructor had finally come home. The aftermath of the Range Sector 4 malfunction didn't settle with a bang, but with the slow, steady hum of accountability. Within 48 hours, Colonel Hale had been reassigned to a logistics desk in a windowless office 3 states away, and the automated range was shuttered for a complete forensic overhaul. The library, for the first time in Eli's tenure, was unnervingly quiet. Not the heavy, stifling silence of a tomb he had cultivated, but a respectful, expectant stillness. Eli sat at his desk, his fingers tracing the serrated edge of the shrapnel in his pocket. For years, that piece of metal had been an anchor, dragging him down into the silt of his own guilt. But as he looked at the morning sunlight hitting the mahogany stacks, the weight felt different. It wasn't a burden anymore, it was a foundation. The glass doors opened, and for once they didn't thud. Lance Corporal Tyler Chris entered alone. Gone was the swagger, the performative volume, and the mocking sneer. He walked to the desk and stood at a rigid attention that looked painful. He didn't speak for a long moment, his gaze fixed on a point just above Eli's head. Senior Chief, Chris said, his voice thick. I'm here to return these. He placed a stack of manuals on the desk, neatly aligned, the edges perfectly flush. And to say that I was wrong. About the library. About you. Eli looked at the young Marine. He saw the flicker of the same ghost he carried, the sudden realization that the world could break at any second. Chris wasn't arrogant anymore. He was awake. The manuals were never the problem, Corporal, Eli said softly, leaning back. The problem was you thought the gear made the warrior. It doesn't. The gear is just a suggestion. The warrior is what's left when the gear fails. Chris nodded, a sharp, jerky movement. Commander Sloane said there's a sign-up sheet for the new curriculum, the bridge program. He hesitated, his confidence wavering. She said it's only for those who are ready to listen. I'd like to be first on the list, sir. If you'll have me. Eli looked at the blank ledger on his desk. He thought about Miller's gap-toothed grin and the dust of Mogadishu. He realized that by hiding in the stacks, he hadn't been honoring his fallen team. He had been letting their lessons die with him. Healing wasn't about forgetting the noise. It was about teaching others how to find the signal within it. 6 a.m. Monday, Corporal, Eli said, his voice regaining that centered, resonant authority. And bring your rucksack. We aren't using the automated range. We're going back to the dirt. As Chris saluted, a slow, meaningful gesture that Eli finally returned with a sharp, disciplined snap, the librarian felt the last of the scrawny mask fall away. A few hours later, Commander Sloan stood in the doorway of the library, watching as Eli moved through the history section. He wasn't hunched over anymore. He moved with the rolling, silent gait of a predator at peace. You look like a man who found what he was looking for, Sloan said, leaning against the frame. Eli placed a book on the shelf, a memoir of a long-forgotten war. He didn't need to scan the exits or map the choke points to feel safe. He was enough. His scars weren't flaws in the wood. They were the grain that made it strong. I spent a long time trying to be a ghost, Rebecca, Eli said, turning to her with a faint, genuine smile. I forgot that ghosts can't teach. And these kids, they need to learn how to survive the shadows. He picked up his thermos and a small box of personal items, leaving the librarian nameplate face down on the desk. He walked toward the door, passing Gunnery Sergeant Ray, who was working on a new crossword puzzle. Tenacious. Eli, Ray called out without looking up. 9 letters. Means not easily discouraged. I know the word, Ray, Eli replied, his voice steady and clear. I think I'm finally starting to live it. As he stepped out into the bright, unforgiving light of the base parade deck, Eli Godwin didn't look like a man past his prime. He looked like a master who had stopped hiding. The warrior hadn't just come home. He had finally decided to stay.